Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thanks, if everyone could take their seats. And thank you all for being so punctual. We're back exactly on schedule, which is great. Makes me feel a lot better. Thank you. Before we move to our next panel, we've got a video address from Commissioner Stella Kyriakides. She couldn't join us today, but she has committed herself to video, and we'll be seeing her just to keep you alert after lunch, and then we will move on to our next panel. So here we go.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, cancer is a word that carries more weight and more meaning than many other words. It touches us all in one way or another, and unless we act decisively, its impact on our families, our health systems, and our economies will continue to grow. But this is a complex disease, and addressing it requires efforts in many areas. Tackling cancer means talking about the food we eat, our lifestyle choices, our environment, and our changing demographics. Innovation and unequal access to treatment are crucial elements in this discussion. So too is the discrimination faced by cancer patients and survivors. We need to take the different parts of this immense puzzle and piece them together so that we can see the overall picture clearly. Today's Second European Cancer Forum is part of this effort, and I'm truly sorry that I cannot be with you in person, but I know that you are in excellent hands. And I am delighted to see that crucial topics like living with cancer and access to innovation are on today's agenda. The European Cancer Forum has hit the nail on the head. We are indeed entering a new era in cancer care, one that takes each of these various strands into account. In fact, this is the very goal of Europe's Beating Cancer Plan, to strengthen our approach at every key stage of the disease. But the first step involves listening. We have to gather as wide a range of perspectives as possible. The Second European Cancer Forum gathers key decision makers, scientific leaders, patient groups, industry partners, and other important stakeholders in one room. Each of you brings vital expertise to the table. Each of you offers a unique perspective. And such insight is the foundation upon which we will build the plan. Next week, on 4th February, I will be launching the public consultation for the Cancer Plan at an event in the European Parliament. I invite you all to join me, and I urge you to engage closely with us in the coming weeks and months. Share your knowledge and experience. Let me leave you with a final message. We all need to work together during the process of developing Europe's Beating Cancer Plan. We need to go beyond the usual sectors and bring everyone to the table. We can make a difference by joining forces. We need to strive for more. On that note, I wish you a productive discussion, and I really look forward to engaging closely with you in the coming months and years.
Well, that's great. I think that's a resounding endorsement for what we're trying to do today, and I think really encourages us to really be vocal and to put forward our comments towards the cancer plan. And I'm very grateful for the Commissioner for agreeing to give us that video and her support, even though she couldn't be here in person today. So that's fantastic. We're going to move on now to the second of our three panels. And as I mentioned, this is now talking specifically about the future of access to innovation. We've talked about the massive strides that have been made and will continue to be made in terms of innovation. But as was said by a number of our speakers before, without access, an innovation is simply an invention. And really, we need to make sure that this is accessible to patients across different diseases and across different regions within Europe, and there is a quality of access. And there are a number of challenges to that, which is what we'll explore now. So, as usual, we're going to have a panel discussion, but at first, we want to set the stage and get some facts on the table, so we're actually having a fact-based discussion. So I'd like, first of all, to welcome Bengt Jönsson to give us his view on this. Bengt, as you know, he's a Professor Emeritus at the Stockholm Economics Institute. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I will present my views on access to cancer medicines in Europe based on a recently published report from IHE, the Swedish Institute for Health Economics. And this is the latest in a number of comparator reports, which I have done together with Nils Wilking, who is my oncologist colleague from the Karolinska, and you will see the other authors here on the report. And I've divided my presentation in three parts. So first, I will present some slides on the disease and economic burden of cancer, which are important for understanding and the development and access to cancer medicines in Europe. In the second part, I will present a summary of access to cancer medicines in sales value, and then a few examples based on access measured as volume, actually how many patients who are treated. And then in the third and final, I will discuss some policy issues focusing how access could be approved in the European country context. I'd like to start with this slide here, and you can see here that the cancer incidence and mortality increases very much with age. And this is, of course, a major reason why the burden of cancer increases over time. But there are, of course, a number of other messages as well around here. First of all, cancer patients are at the end of the life spectrum, and the majority of them, they have other diseases, which obviously then means that we have to think about how we are organizing and managing care for these for patients with cancer. There is also another aspect of this, and that is that who's thinking about who's going to pay for cancer, because there's no private insurer who will insure these patients for their cost of cancer. So actually the cost of cancer will, and they already have, but will even so in the future end up with a public payer and with a taxpayer. I think that's something which we have to remember. If we are, of course, looking at cancer mortality, and I'm now looking at mortality, how the number of deaths actually evolves over time. It is still increasing over time because of the effect of the growing number of elderly in the population. But I would also like to point at the significant reduction in mortality here, which we have seen, of course, in the age groups here, the younger age groups in particular, and of course even 15 to 39-year-olds. So we have had tremendous progress in this group. And if we are focusing on the disease burden, and this is a measure which is called DALYs, which is an attempt to try to look at the combined burden of a disease in terms of both mortality and morbidity. However, of course, for cancer, 98% of the DALYs are actually considered. That's explained by the mortality. But you can see two things here. First of all, in 2000, 25% of all disease burden of cardiovascular disease. It has been reduced to 21% in 2016. If you look at cancer, it's actually increased from 19% to 20%. And this is going rather rapidly, and you can see here also that for a lot of countries, including Belgium, where we are today, actually cancer is the major disease burden. Cancer is really driving. So it's not surprising that we now, of course, see the efforts now, of course, also for the European Union, focusing on cancer, because cancer is a big challenge for the future. So if we are going over from the disease burden to the economic burden, this is a figure here which shows the direct cost of cancer per capita. In the end of the slide here, you have the 200 euro. That is what the average citizen in Europe spends on cancer. Or here you see the different healthcare systems, because this report has a healthcare system approach. And you can see here that there are some countries up here, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Germany, Netherlands, Austria, who spends, of course, a far higher amount in 2000 on cancer than the average. But you can also see here at the left, there is a number of countries who spend significantly less. Actually, if we take and adjust for purchasing power parities, there is a fivefold difference between the European countries in how much they are spending on cancer. And if we are not taking purchasing power parity, but actually taking the current exchange rate, it's more than a tenfold difference. And it's the exchange rate which obviously matters when you are buying cancer medicines at the international market. So this is very important to remember. And it's also important to remember here that while 20% of the disease burden is in cancer, it is maybe rather surprising for some that maybe the share of cancer in total healthcare costs is between 4 and 7%. I think the average is something around 5-6%. And it's rather interesting. This share has been unchanged since about 30 years. It has not really changed. Interesting also, if you're interested in a big country to the west, United States, they have exactly the same share. They obviously have 5% of a much higher healthcare expenditure per capita, it's twice as we have. But it of course says that cancer has not really been an economic issue. I have been working a lot in different innovations in, say, cardiovascular disease and in a lot of other diseases. But cancer has been, from an economic point and from an access point, really under the radar, because you did what you could do and nobody really talked so much about the cost. So we can see, of course, that the direct cost, the healthcare expenditure for cancer, it is increasing over time. It's about a double in the period the period here between 1995 and 2018. You have a 50% increase in the cancer incidence. But of course also you have, of course, a number of newly approved EMA medicines. And it's interesting, when Nils Wilking and I did the first report in 2005, we noticed that until 1995, there was a total of 40 cancer medicines ever introduced. Okay? And 40 new cancer medicines as much as was introduced during the last 4 years. So this is, so it is really moving, and it is of course moving. Particularly, of course, we have surgery, radiotherapy, etc. Also, but of course the field is moving because we have a number of new cancer medicines which are changing the therapeutic landscape. So what does this then mean in terms of costing? We say actually the cost of cancer has been going up parallel with the total health care cost. But if we look at the cost of cancer medicines, if you're looking back in 2008, a little more than 10 years ago, it was about 17-18% of the expenditure on cancer was on medicines. Today, 2018 or 20, we are around 30%. And of course, for some cancer types, like blood cancers and so on, the share of medicines is, of course, much higher. There is, of course, also differences between countries. I would say we have obviously probably some measurement errors here and there as well. But generally, you can say that actually it's the poorer countries who is not only can't spend so much on cancer, but they actually have a rather high share of their cancer expenditure on cancer medicines. So this is just to showing that the cancer medicines is still a rather small share of the total cancer sales, but it is also increasing. We have the indirect cost of cancer. I like to say something about, because we saw that we have had a reduction in the mortality for cancer in the working ages, and that obviously takes also that you have a decrease, particularly here you have for a decrease for men. You have, with increase, of course, of mortality for women, you have a higher labor force participation over time. You here have the 20 on the top here. It's basically indirect costs due to morbidity, that people are off work while they are treating for cancer and so on. It's interesting, we have very little data on those. Obviously, it goes in two directions, because treatments are so much easier for the patients. And I have so many friends from the Stockholm School of Economics who had cancer, but they were working all the time. So that was, but then, of course, with the increasing survival and so on, so there is, but we have really not so good data on that one. But it has obviously been an opportunity to offset some of the direct increase in cost by reductions in indirect cost. But the reason that cancer cost has not increased more, despite the doubling in the share of medicines, is actually that over time, inpatient care for cancer has basically dropped enormously. So we have basically being rationalized. There's obviously a link to the introduction of medicines, but there's also other forces that we actually have increased the use of ambulatory care. While I'm bringing this up is, of course, that for the coming years, there is not so many beds to save anymore in the healthcare system. I think even we are thinking about now with the elderly population with cancer and so on, we may even have gone too far. So there will be more difficulties in the future to offset the increasing cost of cancer medicines from other part of cancer care. So we have to be realistic and assume that the cost of cancer will increase over time. So I will just go over to the access then to new cancer medicines. And here is it's going very rapidly up in terms of number of medicines, and we are up to, and of course it's to say, well, it's obviously the productivity of the pharmaceutical R&D is going up. But there is, of course, another aspect of this also, and that is that the new medicines here are actually what we call targeted therapies. They are directly to very precise, often small groups of patients. So if we are looking at, and I'm not done the calculations, but you can do it yourself, if you are looking at the size of the patient populations, and you are looking at the increase in the R&D spending also, of course, also we have got in dramatic increases in the cost per treated patient. This is obviously a consequences. And another consequences is also in the healthcare system perspective. This is for very specific groups of patients. But the healthcare system treating cancer has to treat all patients every day, every year. Okay, so this is the perspective of the healthcare system, and the payer is, of course, they can't just focus on this is so taking, as we have Karolinska here. Karolinska at the moment, of course, have fantastic cancer care, but also has economic problem. Several hundred doctors and nurses are laid off because there is not a budget. So there is a problem, of course, in the healthcare systems which we have to rely on. And this is, of course, we see this is obviously the sales value, and obviously the big countries in Europe here. We could say, and this is maybe interesting for some, that France in 2008, France were the biggest spender. France has gone down significantly, and there are some specific. I will not go into that, but it has to do with how cancer medicines are paid for in France. On the other hand, Germany actually has come up from 17 to 24%. So there is the cancer market in Europe has a little change over the years as well. But the major issue, of course, as you can see here, is that if we are looking at the cost of medicines has doubled, so it's from 30 to 60 euro per capita here. But you can also see here that there's a huge differences here. Austria has the highest per capita, Switzerland also. They're up here in the hundreds of euro, more than 50% more than the average. But you also have a lot of countries here on the other side, which has far lower spending on cancer medicines, which obviously is an access issue which I will come back to. And here we have divided in this report the countries in Europe in the report, which is EU countries plus Norway and Switzerland and Iceland, into three groups of countries according to GDP per capita. Here the mid here is the biggest group. That's the five big. There's 5 big countries in Europe. This is the richer, smaller countries, which we call the upper tier, with around 75 million people here. I think it's 350 or something. And then we have the low tier here, which is basically nearly half of the countries of the European Union, but they have a total population of over 100 million. Okay. So, and of course you can see a couple of things here. Even if in the lower tier here, obviously consumption of cancer medicines goes up, but you can see it goes up even more in the mid tier and the upper tier. Actually here, these countries are pretty similar if you look at the total uptake. Here we also we look at cancer medicines like wines, a little of the vintage, and you can see the vintage here, the last 2 years here is obviously very little here in the low tier countries. If we take drugs in cancer medicine introduced the last five years, you can see here actually this is the introduction of immunotherapy, who obviously give a big boost in this period to that. But you can also see actually that the increase is actually for cancer medicines 5 years and older. That's all the ones which are used in regular medical practice. So this was in volume. The problem with volume is that in sales. Sales is a price times volume, and we know that of course prices are differ between countries, even if they don't differ that much. So obviously what you see in sales, you will also see in volumes. But when you're starting to compare in volume, you have to compare specific drugs, because otherwise you can't just add apples and oranges. So this is just an example. Pertuzumab is a drug which was introduced 2013 for breast cancer, used together with tamoxifen. I'm just taking this up here because, as you see, during the last 5 years here in the big countries, it's actually a rather similar uptake. But if we use on breast cancer medicines in general, we can then see here, obviously, that trastuzumab was introduced 20 years ago. And you can see here there's rather similar usages in the countries here. It's quite high use also in the low-income countries here, but it actually varies quite a lot. If we are looking at drugs like pertuzumab, we see rather rather variation in the use, a very small use in some. And here is, of course, the new drugs coming in receptor positive but HER2 negative breast cancer. They have just come in. We don't really see them. And I will come back to this because trastuzumab has now been on the market for 20 years, and actually was the introduction of trastuzumab who was a major reason why we started with this report, because we saw that the healthcare system has difficult to handle this type of combinations of testing and treatment. But you can see here, there are a clear difference between the countries here, and then of course we can also see significant variant. Particularly, this is a use of emtansine here, which are used when trastuzumab not anymore is working. If we are looking at lung cancer from an access perspective in volumes here, I've just taken crizotinib here. It's rather to crizotinib is for ALK positive. I only have 2 or 3 slides. Right? ALK positive lung cancer, and you can see here that this is a very clear targeted therapy, but despite that, you can see here is a big differences between the 5 big countries here. Obviously, much less use in UK, even if it is a very clear targeted therapy where you can identify exactly which patients who can benefit from it. If we are looking at lung cancer in general, we can see that lung cancer here is all over the place in a way. I would like to say huge differences between the richest countries here and we have also of course some variations here, but significantly lower also in the lower income countries. And I will just take and this is the last slide which I'm having here, taking the immunotherapy, and here you can see the very clear immunotherapy is coming up a little uneven in the richer countries, but is coming very, very slowly in the poorer countries. So just a few slides about the policy measures to stimulate the discussion. And the reason, of course, taking up this is that the reason we are now talking about healthcare system and healthcare spending is that we would like to improve outcome. That's what we are aiming for. That means that if we are using resources efficiently, we will have more outcome. And tools for if you're looking at how we could improve efficiency, that's about using resources to have an outcome. But if we don't know how we are using the resources, and actually we are not having any data for these reports from healthcare system where we could link resource use and outcomes. So this is still lacking. We are talking a lot of that we have these data, but basically we have done these reports for 15 years. We still only have the ecological data to base them on. And what's the problem there? It's a technical solution. Well, we have enormous progress in information technology. It's a lack of trust and collaboration between stakeholders. Maybe patients would be interested in it, industry is interested, healthcare system, payers, etc. But someone has to take the lead, and of course, I think the payers and providers is not taking the lead here. I think there is, of course, something that, well, we can't really collect these data, we can misuse them. But I will say also, by not using them, I think we have very high costs. So that's something to remember. The other thing is cost-effectiveness studies on cancer medicine. This is something, if you like to make more outcome out of resources, you have to look at cost and outcome. And I think this tool with cost effectiveness has not at all been used in the way it could have done. It's a fantastic instrument to help to inform the priorities for healthcare, for payers, etc. And just to give an example of this here. This is a recent study, looks at the median and mean life gain among newly approved price per median and mean lifetime by newly approved cancer therapies, 95 to 2017. It may be that the authors are correct, that actually the cost per lifetime gain has not increased very much over time, even if there are other studies who show something different. But my take home from this is that it's all over the place. And this is, of course, also, if you are looking at the European scene, looking at drugs approved for solid tumors in Europe and also with US, there was no link between drug cost and clinical benefit by ESMO MBS and ASCO VFS. And well, we know that overall prices are higher in US. But the problem is, of course, that if we don't have prices related to the data, we will not have an efficient cancer care. So, and the other thing is, of course, Bill Clinton is famous for his statements that he should win the election, so you have to think about it. It's the economy, stupid. And of course here, if we like to have access to the modern medicines in the poorer countries in Europe, you have to think about a new payment models, as I'm indicated here. And now the chairman is really sitting at the edge here, so I have my last slide. I'm very lucky for that. But just to say also here that say today's innovations is tomorrow's generics and biosimilars. So obviously that a big value creation from pharmaceutical innovation is, of course, the possibility to have generic medicine. And we have had a lot of generics in cancer now with cost savings in docetaxel introduced 85% price reduction. We will probably see biosimilar if we are looking at other markets in the same here. But of course, if healthcare systems should use this, they need to have an active planning and management. And the sad thing about the generics and the biosimilars is that it's not the countries who actually could take most benefits from them who are using them most. So that's something which we also can take out. So thank you very much for, and sorry for going over the time of it.
Thank you, Bengt. Would you like to join our panel? I'll sit here, but then if you move on. Thank you. Thank you very much, Bengt. I mean, that's a very good introduction, I think, to the panel, demonstrating that there is quite a lot of gross inequality in terms of access, certainly to medicines, a lack of alignment with that with outcome, variation in prices, and also you've suggested some policy solutions and the role of cost effectiveness and the need for data to actually link access with outcomes and price with outcomes, which we don't have systematically in the system. So to join me to discuss the broader issues and look at access and policy solutions, you'll be involved as well, but I'd like to invite on stage Lieve Veering, who is board member of Digestive Cancers Europe. Thank you, Lieve. Ortwin Schulte, who is head of Unit Health Policy, German Permanent Representation to the EU. Wim Roth, who is a professor of health economics at Maastricht University, and Deepak Khanna, who we've introduced before, regional president for Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Canada for MSD Oncology. Thank you very much. Just grab a seat, whichever one's free. Thank you. So I think we want to really focus on this issue of access and improving it. Maybe could I start with you, Lieve, maybe giving us the personal, sorry, not personal, the patient perspective, which may be personal, around access and inequalities of access, and really, yeah, what does it mean for a patient, this kind of inequality?
So for most digestive cancers, the current health systems are organized suboptimally and sometimes even irrationally. Despite the strong evidence that colorectal cancer screening saves lives and saves money, very little is done by Europe, the member states in Europe. In fact, only one of the countries in Europe organizes screening campaigns in line with the guidelines. And the guidelines mean that 65% of the citizens between 50 and 74 years old are screened. If all countries in Europe applied screening campaigns like in Slovenia, in the Netherlands and the Basque region, 130,000 patients would not die and 3 billion euro would be saved every year. For most digestive cancers, the outcomes by treatment centers differ significantly within countries. Top centers achieve 85% overall survival rates for colorectal cancer. If all centers in Europe achieve this result, 120,000 patients would be kept alive every year. This is not innovation. This is the application of best practices. We applaud the Belgian initiative to limit the number of centers for esophageal and pancreatic cancer surgery to around 10 centers and 10 hospitals. With regard to pharmaceuticals, everybody is to blame for the late access to innovation. Pharmaceutical companies have launched plans that differ significantly by country. It cannot be that companies give priority to the richest and biggest countries first. Governments deliberately delay approval of new drugs by budgetary reasons, regardless of the value of the innovative medicines. Countries wait for other countries to determine their prices so that they can align their prices to the lowest. And biosimilar companies should also be available everywhere at the same time. Again, companies have different launch strategies according to the size and budget of the country. We want all drugs to be on the market 6 months after approval by the European Medicines Agency. So what is the point of further innovation if existing best practices are not applied? What is the point of arguing about the sustainability of the system when money is being wasted in other parts of the system? Everybody argues about the cost of medicines, but nobody has any idea about the value of innovation in health economic terms. In order to understand the value, we also need figures on savings in other parts of the healthcare system. In societal economic gains, thanks to reduced premature mortality, and the economic gain thanks to the labor productivity gains. You cannot argue about costs without calculating total value. Our system is irrational at the moment.
That's great, thank you.
That's also what Professor Benson was saying, a lot of those things.
Yeah, I think it resonates very well with that presentation. So I'm sort of trying to capture some of this so we can put it forward in a poll in terms of what we put forward for the EU Commission's consideration. What I captured there was, I think, unification of access processes, accelerated access processes, but unification of those across the EU. Consolidation of best practice and accountability for outcomes according to those best practices. I got that from what you said. And I think to capture political will, particularly in I guess, finance ministries, is to articulate this in terms of being an investment and putting actually trying to quantify that investment. So those were things that maybe we could try and build into the poll to see whether there were important considerations for the Commission. Ortwin, could I turn to you now? I wonder if you could give us a perspective on this issue of access. And I think you may want to talk about, Bengt talked about the role of HTA and the role of cost effectiveness analysis and so on as a tool, but not necessarily a decision-making aid, but not necessary, but not sufficient for decision-making, is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you very much. It's my honor to speak after Lieve, who was in the last legislation period of the European Parliament one of the most influential MEPs on health policy. And I would say the issue of access to pharmaceuticals always is a guarantee for quite emotional and heated debates between the institutions in the European Union, and the topic of in relation to cancer not being an exception to that. Looking back at the last German presidency, which was 2007, we had also one access topic at that time. It was antiretroviral pharmaceuticals and HIV/AIDS. And taking from that direction, after long consultations with all the stakeholders and institutions, we agreed on the wording that this is a complex puzzle, just to take account. And also speaking for the permanent representation of Germany to the European Union, I would say there is some clear EU competence for increased action, especially in the field of availability of pharmaceuticals and therapies, issues like tackling shortages, also with the use of some policies of the EU outside health policy, the general issue of functionality of EMA and the pharmaceutical market authorization, especially the perspective of Brexit, and of course the incentives which have to be revisited in issues like orphans, pediatrics, and also antibiotics. However, no presentation from Germany here in Brussels without the statement that the affordability and the health systems management is something which is left to the national competence, and so we have to find synergies and balance. And as we speak, we are also, European Commission is holding a meeting on some competition law aspects of pharmaceutical policy, which also might be a contribution in that regard. And the moderator kindly also reiterated to the big piece of legislation, which is currently in the Council, the health technology assessment. In that regard, I won't speak too long on that, but I would say that after some 2 years of negotiations and having a statement from the European Parliament, not having a very simple situation in the Council, because we have 4 member states, national parliaments, having subsidiarity objections, but there is a general political need to come to terms and to come to a conclusion, which, and that might be certain, will not be based very much on the principles which the European Commission proposed. It might be some severe changes, but I think also with a view to keeping the pace in EU legislation and EU legal lawmaking, some severe progress, I don't say the word finalization, but some considerable progress in 2020 would be very much needed. Cancer specific, I won't comment anything. There are things which are more communicated by Berlin than by the modest permanent representation in Brussels, but this will be done, I would say, in the foreseeable future. And just one aspect which Bengt also highlighted, lack of data. There is an initiative under German presidency regarding European health data space, which also includes research data and access to research data, where we hope we will identify some progress. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So there, I think you mentioned data, and I think the adoption of HTA regulation, the proposal, obviously in the pipeline. Okay, so we can put those into our poll. So thank you very much. We can address those, and we'll come back and circle back, with the poll results. Wim, your view as another economist, your view in terms of access, and I don't know, I mean, perhaps you'd like to discuss things like collaboration on pricing, some of the barriers to delays and initiatives that might work to speed up access in those places where it's lacking.
Yeah, mainly about the barriers. In following up on what Lieve has said before, and also some of the presentation of Bengt, I think that we all agree that patients should have quick access to effective treatments for cancer, including effective pharmaceuticals. There's not much controversial, I think, about that. And I think also with respect to the discussion, I think it's good to make it a bit more controversial, because actually what we see in theory, we all agree that quick access is important. In practice, in reality, we see rather the opposite. We see that over the years, or at least over the past 15 years, the time between market access approval and reimbursement decisions has been lengthened. And on average, it differs a bit between countries in the European, but on average, it takes more than a year after a drug has been approved for a drug also to be included in the reimbursement package. And that, of course, is bad news. That's bad news to begin with for patients, of course, who have to wait longer before effective treatment becomes available for them. It's also, of course, bad news for pharmaceutical companies who have to wait longer before they can bring the product, actually sell the product on the market. An important reason for this longer delay, as Lieve has also already mentioned, are the bureaucratic barriers that have been imposed on reimbursement decisions. And I think an important one of them is the use of health technology assessment and economic evaluation in the decision process about reimbursement. What we've seen is that a number of countries over the past years have introduced economic evaluation as part of the decision-making process, and a number of other countries have made more strict requirements about the quality of the economic evaluation before a decision is being made. And that it makes, health technology assessment research is costly. It's a very costly form of research, and the stricter requirements also makes that it has become even more costlier. Also because almost all countries ask for an independent and a separate form of economic evaluation in the decision process. So the cost for doing this research is multiplying. I'm an economist, and from an economist, I think this whole economic evaluation is a rather doubtful and puzzling kind of research. To begin with, it's rather shaky science. The outcomes very much depends on the assumptions that you make, and depending on the assumptions, you can make something being cost effective or rather the opposite. The decisions about what discount rate to use, what cost to include, more or less determines what outcomes you get. Also, the question about how to elicit patient preferences and quality of life is now not really founded in economic theory. So you can. It's very manipulative, this kind of research, and also if that doesn't work, then what you frequently observe is that the thresholds are being adjusted upwards or downwards. I think one of the strange things is that we in the Netherlands use a threshold of 80,000 euros per QALY for considering something cost effective. I believe here in Belgium it's 35,000. Now I don't think many people would think that a Dutch person is twice as valuable as a Belgian one. Still, we attach more than twice as much value to a life in good health as Belgium does. So it's very arbitrary. These thresholds. Also, and I think perhaps even more worryingly, it's used opportunistically by pharmaceutical companies. What you see is that some pharmaceutical companies actually set prices at a level on which a new pharmaceutical is barely just cost effective. So it's actually works against that. The whole idea behind economic evaluation is that it can be used for cost containment. Actually, you see that in some cases it actually leads to higher prices than you would otherwise have. Furthermore, studies by the OECD show that cost effectiveness, those economic evaluation, hardly contributes to cost containment. So it's really not very effective. So I think in order to make these the pharmaceuticals accessible to patients quicker, what we all want, I think it's good to rethink the use of economic evaluation in decision making about reimbursement.
Okay, so I just to try and capture this for our famous poll, you're talking about greater sort of simultaneity of authorization and reimbursement, if it's possible, that moving towards that?
At least the gap,
convergence.
to reduce the gap as much as possible.
And are you, I'm sure you don't mean, maybe you don't mean this, but I don't know, abolishing HTA or just downgrading its significance in the access decision?
No, I think you can very well do without it. I
Okay.
think there are other ways.
you go.
I think it's good, of course, that you don't accept all the prices that pharmaceutical companies ask for their products, that you negotiate about prices. But I think it's far more effective to look at to organize bargaining power by bargaining about prices at the national level or international level, and just everything what you also see, it hardly makes it makes no difference at all. I mean, all products that actually work are also eventually being reimbursed. So why this whole circus of economic evaluation in between?
All right, I'm sure we'll have some comeback on that. Dare we put it on the poll? Let's abolish HTA. Go on, put it on the poll. Let's see. Okay, Deepak, maybe you want to respond to that, but maybe let's give us your view on that.
So I love the access debate because it is such a healthy debate, and it's good to have these discussions. Let me start there. What I thought I would start with is, as opposed to providing our own facts, I'm just going to plagiarize some of the facts that Bent and others present. So let me start by showing you some of the facts here, because it's a much easier way to go. I do have a view on HTA as well. I guess I should put that on the table. I do think that HTA just isn't really fit for purpose for the new innovations. So when you take a look at the new innovations, right, what's really changed? Well, you've got a drug that now could potentially work for 20 different tumors. And then that drug may be used on its own, it may be used in combination, it may be used with a test, it may not be used without a test. But for an HTA, they were never equipped to take one drug and look at it iteratively every 1 or 2 months for the same drug with a new indication in a new population. Our system just wasn't designed to do that. So I do think that the system itself needs to be made fit for purpose for new innovations that come. When I take a look at some of the bureaucracy, I do agree that patient access should be more consistently applied, right? If you have a patient in Poland, they're going to get 1 out of 5 new cancer medicines. If you look at patients in Hungary or Slovakia, they'll get access to half the medicines that a patient in the UK gets. So how do we provide access or find ways to be able to do this in a more equitable way? But when we look at everything together, we still know that cancer itself is going to be the largest burden of disease. It's going to eventually it's going to surpass hypertension. It's going to surpass others. So we have to really look at how do we tackle this. And I know, Bent, you show this, that cancer spending overall has been pretty stable over the last 20 years. So if you take a look at the challenge that we have, should we be putting more into overall cancer spending? How do we find the right way to do this? Because there are savings in other areas. Bent showed data on biosimilars and other things. There are ways to be able to put more into cancer as we know how important this becomes, right? When you look at, we have made a lot of progress. So if you, Bent showed some of the data with our population. If you population adjust, cancer mortality is declining. So we are making progress. We just have a much more opportunity to do more. So to me, there are 2 very important questions. The first one is, how do we work across the different healthcare systems to enable timely access? The second one is, how do we ensure that we get the right appropriate funding to be able to support innovation? I think we generally agree that that's what we'd like to ensure we do it. I want to just go back to my opening comment. One of the things that we should all feel very proud of is we talk about some of the new innovations that come, right? 10 years ago, if you had skin cancer, you've got a 1 in 20 chance of being here 5 years later, a 5-year survival. If you look at that data today, you've got a 1 in 2 chance of being here. And why is that? It's better screening, it's better prevention, it's better access to some of these new innovations and therapies. So ultimately, the innovation that we're bringing is providing more hope and letting people live longer. And that's what we aim to do. Now, how do we do that in a more, in a way that enables us to continue to fund it and support it? The Minister of Health for Belgium, when she was here talking, Maggie was here, she spoke about one of the amazing innovations that we did that I'm very proud of, is we were able to get multiple stakeholders together to sit down and tackle this problem by including policymakers, government officials, healthcare providers, pharmaceutical companies, economists, academicians, everyone together, patient advocacy groups, to say, if we can have early access to this innovation, if we can have a multi-year, multi-indication agreement that provides the predictability and the stability to the government so they know how much they're going to be spending over this period. But for the patient, they get earlier access to these medicines. She provided a striking fact, which was they were able to accelerate access to innovation from a year to 1 month. And then when you look at the gain over that 3 years, it's an additional, I believe she said 5,000 additional life years gained for citizens in Belgium. That's the reason that I believe we all want to do this, is by providing earlier access, we are using our healthcare resources more wisely, more effectively. So I'll give that as an example because I think that's an example of when everyone's working together to be able to solve this. So someone said it earlier. In summary, there is no value of innovation if we don't provide access to that innovation. We just need to do it in a way that's affordable for our system.
Okay, so again, you can correct me if I'm wrong. What I captured from that was possible interventions could be increased budget for cancer, which is commensurate with the burden and its epidemiology now. I think you were arguing something slightly different, which call it value assessment is not fit for purpose. So it's a wholesale revision of value assessment processes rather than its abolition. Revision of that, maybe taking into account, making it fit for the personalized paradigm, making it, and maybe putting different value parameters, including long-term societal savings and so on that you were talking about. I think the other thing you mentioned was a sort of playbook of accelerated access schemes or mechanisms that could be used.
Yeah.
Maybe that's another recommendation that could be put in. So that's very helpful because I think, is there anything else that I've missed? Anyone, have I missed anything that we'd like to then put forward to the delegates? No. Okay.
I would just say that I think the system needs to look at how to be more fit for purpose. So even on the industry side, how do we come up with alternative reimbursement schemes? So besides the multi-year, multi-indication, are there other things? Are there flexible pricing options? Are there other ways that we can evaluate the value of the medicines, whether it's a risk-sharing agreement or other things that make more sense based on the value of what we provide? So I think that also enables us to get earlier access, but provides a little bit more predictability and stability in terms of what we have to pay for.
Okay. Well, we can have some more comments while we can we ready for the poll, do you think? Can we? No, not yet? Okay. All right. So any questions from the floor while we get this poll up and ready, running for us? Any questions on this? Yeah, look, here we go. Brilliant. Thank you. And if it's addressed to somebody in particular, please.
No, I would like to, Denis Lacombe from the EORTC, I would like to interrogate the panel on 4 papers. More specifically, I guess they are familiar with. The first one is a paper that was published 6 months ago by the HTA body in Germany, IQWiC, which actually claimed for illusion of precision of medicine and precision oncology in particular. So it's an HTA paper. I don't know if there is an HTA body in the room. And these data are quite shocking in terms of how far drugs registered from the point of view of the HTA do really translate into benefit into the healthcare system. And this is corroborated by 3 other papers, one published by a British group 2 years ago, and actually 2 other papers published also 6 months ago in the JAMA. Basically these 3 papers looked at the drug register until 2017, either by EMA or FDA, if it's in the JAMA or in the British group. And basically, the conclusion is that there are barely 20-30% of the drug registered by the regulators, which translate into clinical benefit for the patients. So again, don't get me wrong, I don't claim that we should hold access to innovation to patients, but my question is, do we know how to recognize innovation today? And the fact is, I guess, that most of these trials, or most of these regulatory trials, have been based on surrogate endpoints such as response rate. And I think we should have also, to some extent, the honesty to say how we document innovation. Is it purely on a response rate, which is a drug-centered endpoint, or on survival and quality of life, which are truly patient-centered endpoint? And don't get me wrong, because I represent the ORTC, so we lead the RESIST program, which validates response rate criteria. So we are very much in favor of response rate, but response rate is a tool to document drug activity. It's not a patient-centered endpoint.
Great. Okay. So I think that's really asking about what is the correct way to do value. People have mentioned value assessments not going right. But what are the correct ways so that we can identify really transformative innovations properly, and we can't grant access to everything all at once, or everything willy-nilly. So what should we be doing to our value assessment processes?
Just a comment on HTA, because I think the problem with HTA is, of course, that they have much less data to work with than they was there. There's very few trials. The trials, which is very few patients, is not a relevant comparator. It's a surrogate endpoint. It's quite obviously, and I think that, and I think the EMA is saying the same thing. We have much less information when the new drugs are coming to the market. Instead, we are saying, okay, what we need to do then is, of course, doing the follow-up studies and say later on what the actual value was for patients. But the problem I see is that those studies are not done. That's, of course, why I said we don't have these data on resource use at the individual patient level. We don't have the outcome data, so we could link it. So I'm a little say, worried about the sustainability of this, because if we are, taking in 10 new drugs every year, 50 in 5 years, and they are all there. And we don't know exactly, and there's a lot of combinations. And suddenly, someone is saying, okay, well, we are spending all this public money. We have no idea exactly what it was. I feel there is a strong problem here. I can see because if you don't like HTA and so on, you at least should be able to look at the efficiency in the actual cancer spending in a country. But if you don't have data on resources for individual patients, the outcome, you can't do the efficiency studies in those countries either. So I'm worried about this, because I've watched a lot of other areas of rapid, and I think MSD has been involved in cardiovascular and so also. And I'll say here that this is a serious problem, and it could be a very, very strong backlash if we don't have the data to back up. And we need the data on the healthcare system level, not on individual patient groups and studies.
If we have the poll ready, I suggest that goes up. We can continue to talk while you vote, because I think it's a rich discussion. So let's go work in parallel if we can. So if my colleagues have the poll ready, you can stick it up. And in the meantime, Wim, you wanted to come back.
Yeah, I must say I'm unfamiliar with the papers that the speaker, the one asking questions, mentioned. But if it's the case that the wrong outcomes are being used, then it's probably, as an economist, I would say, then the wrong outcomes are being rewarded and valued. And I was struck by a slide, a graph that Bengt showed in his presentation, where he had the year of introduction price set out against the price per life year gained, and what he said, it's going all over the place. And that also suggests that there's really no relation between health outcomes and the price that we pay for that. And that I think supports also my claim that about how doubtful HTA studies in this respect is. But it would help then, I think, that we are going to value and reward real outcomes also in this kind of research.
So just to clarify this point about HTA, are you saying that the methods of current HTA are faulty rather than the principle of value assessment?
No, yeah, I think it's both. It's not useful because it doesn't contribute much. I mean, it's very difficult to really use a proof of non-cost effectiveness in decision making. There's always some alternative argument to say that it should be reimbursed. It's very sensitive to the assumptions that you make. Yeah, it's also you see that the prices are not really related to the health outcomes. So it's really the value added of HTA is not all that big. And on the other side, as I said, there's enormous amounts of money being spent on HTA research, and money that can be spent, I think, better in alternative ways to really value outcomes of innovative pharmaceuticals.
Right. Okay. So both of you, Lieve and Deepak, you wanted to come back. So why don't we? And then we can reflect on the poll, which is now clocking up, which is good. Okay.
I would like to reflect on the HTA. Why did we work in the Parliament on the HTA file? Because there is a problem in Europe in certain member states that a new medication arrives much more later on the market than in other member states. So for the patients, that was a big problem. If a new medicine arrives 1 year later in your country than in the member states next door, there is a problem for those people. And that's the start of it. And that's why I defended the HTA on a European level. On that moment, when we have a decision in HTA, then it can go to the member states, this decision, and the minister can decide if they will reimburse or not, because this will always be a decision made by the member state. But the patients have, on this moment, the same opportunity if it's reimbursed than in the other member states. And that is not what we have at the moment with the HTA in the different countries.
Yes, Deepak.
Yeah, from an HTA perspective, yes, they are different across different countries, right? You can get an IQWiC evaluation that may say minor benefit or significant added benefit. You can get in France, you can get an ASMR rating of a 3 or a 2 or a 4. In Italy, you may be able to meet the innovation funds, you may not. In the UK, it may be cost effective based on the price with NICE, or it may not be. But for us, at least there is a mechanism by which we are able to show the value of the innovation, right? Through each, they may be different, but there is a mechanism by which we can show that value. And as we go through with each of the countries and we look at, is this a benefit over the current standard of care, and what is the GDP in that country, and what is the affordability, and being able to adjust for that, there is a way for us to be able to demonstrate that value. And I think that's very important. I think what we also do need to resolve, though, is why does that access take so long across the different member states? Why is it earlier in some countries and take maybe a year or longer in the other countries? And how do we ensure that it's available earlier across all of the markets?
Okay. Alton, you wanted to?
Just on the comment from the public, in Germany, as you know, for some long years there has been a free pricing for patented drugs, and that has been changed some 10 years ago, introducing or limiting it to 1 year's time, and then introducing an HTA system. And I would cautiously describe that as a successful process, because it's, if you compare 15 years ago, pharmaceutical pricing was one of the major topics in the German healthcare system. It isn't anymore. There are other topics. And that's also, I would say, due to the fact that HTA has been introduced. But I would agree that HTA is very closely linked to some specificities of the national healthcare system. So it's a bit problematic to speak about HTA because there are very different techniques behind the HTA. And that's the rationale behind the well-known wish of most of the bigger member states to avoid a legally binding system and to have some room to maneuver in that.
Okay. So I don't know if we'll still take some more questions. We've got a little over 20 minutes left. So do you want, I'm asked my panel to reflect on those answers. Let's have a look. So unsurprising, I think it's unsurprising that we're talking about reimbursement schemes and regulation that reduces barriers, speeds up patient access. So that they're kind of related, those two top ones. Does anything surprise you, or do you want to sort of comment on that? Harmonizing EU-wide accelerated access, that they're all about, yeah, okay.
It's not surprising. I think that, as we've all been talking about with HTA, whether it's partially to reform it to make it more fit for purpose, or whether it's just to be able to accelerate that access, you'd expect that in terms of identifying new reimbursement schemes to speed up access. Again, there is some movement. So even in Germany, I know now you could take EMA approvals within a 6-month period and combine them to have discussions. That is designed to be able to speed up, hopefully, some of the indications that are spread out. I know that, like we talked about, there are several countries where you'll have a 3-year or 4-year agreement across different. So we are making advances to try to look at this in a different way, but obviously those make sense in terms of priorities.
Okay. So we have a question at the back there. Yes, please.
I just see that we should give certainty to the industry, but not to the patients, in your question. So my point is, since most of the clinical trials are done with no comorbidity for the patients under 65 years old, and most of the patients, 60 to 65% is older than 65, can we not make a deal with the pharmaceutical industry? We should reimburse if the treatment has a better outcome than expected.
So I couldn't quite get. I got that you're saying that this is that there's a mismatch between trials and reality because of the patients themselves. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, most patients have comorbidity.
Yes.
So the point is that to reimburse the treatment, it should be make a deal with the company that if the patient has a better outcome than what is expected,
right,
then it should be reimbursed. If it's less, it should not be reimbursed.
Okay.
That's a fair deal.
So I think just unpacking that, I would suggest there's two issues there. One is about the licensing requires certain trial data, which kind of incentivizes these select groups which don't reflect real-world usage, which I would argue is a problem with the licensing system, maybe, or it's a problem with how we then use the licensing to make authorization decisions. The second point is really about, it's an innovative access scheme. It's saying we'll take real-world data and pay for outcomes when they're achieved, but not when they're not achieved. So I would put that in the endorsing the first two categories of suggestion there, perhaps. But any comments on that point, that it is effectively you're advocating an access scheme that pays for outcomes?
Yeah, I think that in principle is a good idea. However, I think that there's many steps you can set before that. You see very frequently that physicians prescribe medication, even although they know that it's probably not so very effective, that they continue treatment with, even if they know that the treatment has very little effect. So more effective prescription and treatment of patients, I think by that you can achieve much more efficiency than tying it immediately to the reimbursement of the drugs.
And we do look at piloting different types of reimbursement schemes. Sometimes the challenge is in the country itself. Do they have the infrastructure to be able to track and monitor this across different patients? Do they have the ability to actually measure this? So I think part of this, and maybe Bent, you can comment, is do we have the right level of patient tracking and databases and the ability to monitor this? I think that's different across the countries.
No, it's obviously correct that if we don't have the data when the product comes to the market to actually assess the value, then it's very difficult to have a value-based price. So then we say, well, okay, we don't know, so let's follow up and see the value. And of course, there is a number of those schemes also, but those are dependent, of course, on that you both should be able to track the patient who's going to have it, and also to track the outcome for that patient. And those two things, it's not, and all such system, I remember, we have introduced a DRG system in a lot of countries. It is actually where you classify patients. That was a long process, and it was basically used as a classification process. We don't have a classification process, even with cancers here. And if you don't have that, then you can't design an outcome-based, because there's so many mistakes. Because at first they have decided to have this outcome-based payment, and then they say, well, we maybe need some data for this as well. You have to start with the data, and then when you have the data, you can discuss about if you can use them for this. But I see this is very important. I think it's very important because we are dealing here with something which is very important for the patients, very important to have the right treatment. So the patients like to have the treatment which has the best outcome. And of course, the industry would like to have a reward which is related to the value therefore. And then we have to have a system. We may say, well, cost-benefit or cost-effectiveness analysis is not a perfect tool. But you know, it's a tool, you have something to talk about. And you have to have a dialogue. And I'm pretty sure I've seen a lot of examples over many years that industry has had a lot of help with actually being able to discuss. And actually, to be able to discuss a payment scheme, you actually need to be able to have a cost effectiveness analysis, because value is different for different patients. And the big problem we have now is that we are thinking that one price fits all. And this is exactly wrong, because now that with individual, there is basically one value for each patient. And this is what we have to take into account, because otherwise we get the reimbursement institutes doing what they're doing now. They say, oh, you want this price. Oh, okay. We'll see if we have any patients where there is a value which is up to this price. But this price is 80% is reward for the cost of developing the drug. We should, of course, try to treat all patients who can actually benefit from this. It's like flying a plane only with only persons in business class and having the whole other seats empty. It's a ridiculous way of actually, and then of course it takes much longer time, because we will never get the data to know if the patient actually is benefiting from this. So I think that really the real key thing here is we are talking a lot about these real world data, which should substitute for the lack of the traditional HTA method, is to take 2,000 randomized clinical trials and assess them. We don't have those anymore. We have to have something else. But we really have to, because patient, industry, and the payer need something to collaborate about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a tough balance, right? Because when you have very striking data with an innovation, you want to be able to provide that to patients as quickly as possible. You may not have all the data that is needed to be able to do the evaluation at that time. So I do believe having follow-up data or real-world evidence or other data after is important to be able to continue that. But we don't want to slow down access for those patients in that interim. So how do we strike that fine balance to make it work? And I think that's sometimes a bit of the debate as well.
I mean, yeah, sorry, I don't want to intervene if there's people. So, yeah, so let me just take one on at the back, and then you, madam, if that's all right. So, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, so you've already asked a question, haven't you, on this panel? So if you don't mind, I'd like to ask this lady first, if that's okay.
Fair enough.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to be as fair as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much also for all the interesting presentations. I would like to take one step back, please. We talked earlier this morning about the importance of having a holistic approach. Now I feel that we have very much a drug approach, and that's in line with the theme, right? But if we want to provide efficient healthcare, we need to look also at the basics. And I'm trying to go back to the point I made earlier this morning, looking at all the aspects of the patient and not only fighting the tumor. If you have a patient who is denourished, malnourished, who has lost 10, 20, 30 kilos, if not more, you can give him the best treatment. He will not respond to it. He will be too weak. So my plea today is not forget the basics, feeding the patient. Then you can talk about treatment, but that should be really a holistic approach and not focusing on the treatment only. Thank you very much.
So any views? I mean, I think it's a very valid point. Yeah.
No, yeah, that's also, I mean, coming back on Benk's presentation, who made a point about the inequalities across Europe in access to pharmaceuticals. You should, I think, also put more in a holistic perspective. Yes. Of course, patients in some parts of Europe also don't have so much access to screening and the latest tools for diagnosis, for example. When they need to have access to treatment, it very much depends on who they know and what context that they have. It depends on under-the-counter payments that they make. So I think also in that perspective, I think that we should look the way that people cope in Central and Eastern European countries, cope with cancer, involves much more than only the access to pharmaceuticals. And I think you need to address all of that, including all the corruption that is in these systems, to provide them with equal access and equal treatment as we have here in the west of Europe can look forward to.
Yeah, and just extending that point, if I may, I mean, I just wondered whether if one were to take the value assessment processes that go on with medicines and apply it to nutrition or to MDTs and so on, multidisciplinary teams and so on, one would come up with quite a high value, I'd expect, in terms of any HTA approach. And so, I think that...
Well, I think that, Mary's presentation that just looked at what are across the patient journey, what are the gaps from diagnosis, treatment, prevention. There are so many things that we do well in certain countries in Europe that I would hope other countries can look at and say, well, why are they getting so much earlier diagnosis in these countries? Why are they getting earlier access to, is it the education that's involving them in prevention, other elements of what we need to do across the patient pathway? So I think we have some very good data that we need to really look at, digest, and try to take those best practices and apply it across the market. So I agree that it's much more than access to medicines. Unfortunately, that was just this panel.
Yeah. So something we can re-examine when we look at lung cancer as an exemplar of inequalities of outcomes, inequalities of other processes in healthcare, I guess. Thank you, sir, for your patience. Yeah.
Very simple man, so I live by example, and I'm sure many of you were in the plenary session of the American Society of Clinical Oncology last year, and I think it's important that we learn from our mistakes. And I would like to report one presentation in the plenary session about the registration of olaratumab in soft tissue sarcoma, in a subpopulation of soft tissue sarcoma. The drug was registered by DMA and made accessible through some countries based on a phase 2 showing a very large survival benefit. Fortunately, the people behind did their job correctly and they pursued the development, and in the phase 3 the survival curve were exactly superimposable. So the drug was decommissioned. I think we have to be careful and look at the data. And I'm sympathetic for, of course, access to all patients across Europe to innovation, but in that case, the patients who were protected were those who actually did not get access to the drug, because at least they didn't suffer from the toxicity, because there was absolutely no benefit. So I think we should learn about and we should take decisions based on data and data that are meaningful to patients. Otherwise, we keep making mistakes.
I think that's the balance that we all have to work through, because in that same example, if the phase 3 study would have been more positive, but we waited until after phase 3, we would be all arguing, well, why did we deny patients until that phase 3, right? So the balance we have is how do we take interim data or early data and what do we do with it with the appropriate patients until more confirmatory data comes out. So that's the place that we will continue to make the best qualitative judgments as well as quantitative judgments to be able to see what's the right thing to do. But it's, we could have switched the phase 3 results around and having a different debate on a different drug.
Right. Okay, so that's fair enough. Yannis, yeah.
From a clinical point of view, when I discuss with a patient with terminally cancer diagnosis, he or she will be taking the risk for a novel therapy if his or her chance are to live longer, durability of response, and even functionally cure. This is the best weapons of new innovative drugs, and this is called the value of hope. How do you measure, dear financial and economical managers, this value of hope?
Okay. So yeah, how do you build that into a cost-effective, and is it, I'll extend that question, what does that do to the sustainability of a health system if you are then putting a value on hope as well? So how do you measure it, but is it also, what do you think of its validity as a process?
I don't think we should all try to put that into money and into monetary terms. I think one conclusion we can draw from this discussion is that we should focus on the things that matter to patients, and patients for patients it doesn't matter much how much it costs. And whether it's cost effective or not. For patients it matters whether it works or not. And that is something we should focus the discussion on, and not whether or not it by some study it's found that it's cost effective or not.
The piece that I will never be able to quantify but has the most fulfillment for me are the letters that I get from patients that are put on our therapies, and they say, thank you very much. 3 years ago I was told by my physician that get your affairs in order. You have 3, 4, 5 months left to live. I'm here 3, 4, 5 years later, and I'm very grateful. So that is not quantifiable by any economic measure that I'm aware of, but it's probably the reason we're all here, and it's the most satisfying. So that's what we always have to look at, is how much hope we can provide and what's the right way to do that.
Do you want to say anything, Ben?
I guess that it's very difficult for, say, reimbursement agencies. We obviously have, because they need to make decisions about what we should spend the money on. And there is obviously a legislation. If I'm looking at the Swedish one, they're saying obviously if this is very essential for the patient. Otherwise, we look at the magnitude of clinical benefit, and we looked at cost effectiveness. Those are the criteria with the reimbursement agencies, I should say. If you're asking them, they will say, well, we don't pay for hope. That's not our role. We have to make a decision about reimbursement based on the best possible data about that the patient can benefit from this drug. And I think that we have to really think about is that every public payment system which you have has to be protected. Otherwise, it's not sustainability. Right. So many examples that if criteria startup illusion, not criteria clear about it also, you lose it. We have had, dental health insurance and so on in Sweden, gone on and off, and there is a big issue, because we need to have a decision-making process where the general public who is paying for this knows, of course, that this is actually coming for the benefit of the patient. And of course, we need the data for it. EMA needs to data. EMA is not doing a value assessment. They're just doing an assessment of the safety and other. And they have to do it. But someone has to do this. What should we pay for? And we have to ask us these questions. If they don't have 100 million people in Europe don't have access to this, why don't they have access to them? Because the prices are too high for them. Well, then we can lower the prices for them. Well, there's no problem with that, is it?
But I agree, you have to have a system to be able to demonstrate value. You have to start somewhere. Beyond that value, I do think there is a huge benefit to have clinicians and patient advocacy groups and others sit around that table to look at things beyond the hard endpoints. So whether it's quality of life or other measures that we don't necessarily take completely into account, I've also seen it benefit patients when they're sitting on the table and saying, you know what, you need to look at these endpoints as well, because these are also important to us. And I think it's taking the quantitative and the hard endpoints and adding to it things that make a lot more sense from our clinicians and our patient advocacy groups and others as well to further the assessment.
Okay. All right, we've got a couple of minutes left, just under 2 minutes. There's probably time for one quick question and one quick answer, if anyone has one. Yep. Okay. Yeah, Antonella. And we will have to be fairly quick.
From the patient perspective, what really strikes me is that due to the difference in the HTA process, a treatment is accessible in a country at day 0, and in another country after 2 years, and in another country after 12 years. So this is, I mean, from the patient perspective, this level of inequality is really not acceptable. So what, my question to your technicians, your experts, what can we do to avoid this huge gap in between countries? And what can we propose to the European Commission to include in the cancer plan, but concretely, something concrete? Like I know that HTA harmonization is the answer, but how do we achieve it? How can we learn from Germany, that is one of these countries that starts at year 0, day 0? What can we, how can you pass on the lesson?
Okay, so you have 1 minute to answer this question.
Sorry.
I'll be very quick. EU HTA has been sold as an instrument to safeguard access to pharmaceuticals, but in reality it isn't. It is a rationality technique to improve the assessment, but it wouldn't resolve the problems which are due to the variety of health systems inside the European Union. That's important to note also in terms of expectation management. Have I been short enough?
Yes, that's fantastic. In fact, you've left 45 seconds for anyone else who wants to jump in with any key things that can reduce this inequality in HTA processes. Or in access processes.
Thanks. May I say?
Yes.
We have the problem of innovation for access to patients, but we also have the shortages of medicines, and that is something we really have to find a solution for it. And on European level, I think they can do something together with industry.
All right. Okay, well, maybe we can explore some of these themes with using the specific example of lung cancer in the next panel. But just a round of applause for our panelists. That's really good. And to you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now we have a coffee break and back at 3 p.m., please. Yeah, thank you.